I can still taste that evening in my mouth. The bitterness of overcooked peas, the dryness of the meatloaf, and the sharp aftertaste of words that were never meant to be kind. It was one of those dinners where the air feels thick before anyone speaks, as if the house itself knows what is coming. The table was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums in your ears and makes you notice every small sound. The ticking of the kitchen clock, the scraping of silverware, the faint wheeze of the old ceiling fan above us. Camille sat across from me, shoulders pulled tight, a small frown between her eyebrows even when she smiled. My son Evan sat beside her, his head lowered over his plate, eating like the meal was a task he had to finish before the world ended. My grandson, little Leo, poked at his peas. The boy looked from one face to another, sensing something in the air that he could not name. Children always know before the words arrive. And then, without warning, Camille said it. "You eat, but you do not help." The sound of it landed like a slap, though she said it lightly, almost as a joke. Her tone was careful, sweet even, the way someone speaks when they want to hurt you but still look innocent doing it. I froze, the fork halfway to my mouth. The clock kept ticking. My heart did too, though it felt slower. Evan said nothing. He kept eating, cutting his meat into small, perfect squares. His silence felt heavier than her insult. It pressed against my chest like a stone. I looked at him, hoping to see something in his eyes, confusion, maybe, or even embarrassment, but he never looked back. Camille sighed as if she were tired of carrying something too heavy. Maybe she was. Maybe she thought I was that weight. She stood up, took her plate, and walked toward the sink. Her perfume lingered in the air behind her, the faint smell of lavender and detergent. I set my fork down. I could have answered. I could have reminded them that my hands no longer move like they used to, that every joint in my fingers burns when I wake up, that the pain in my back makes bending down feel like being split in half. I could have told them about the years I worked at the school, the years I stretched a teacher's salary thin enough to keep a family whole. But I didn't. There is a kind of silence that is not surrender. It is simply what remains when words have lost their meaning. Leo looked at me, confused. His fork trembled in his small hand. I smiled at him because that is what grandmothers do. We smile when it hurts so our children will not see how much it does. I reached for my glass of water and took a sip, though my throat felt like sand. Evan finally spoke, not to me but to Leo. "Finish your food, buddy." His voice was gentle, almost kind. For a moment, I thought he might turn to me next, say something, anything, to pull me back into the conversation. But he didn't. He just kept eating. I could hear Camille running the faucet, the clinking of plates, the hum of her favorite TV show in the other room. The world around me went on as if nothing had been said. After dinner, I began clearing the table. Camille told me she would handle it, but I had already picked up the plates. I washed them slowly, careful not to drop any. The warm water numbed my fingers. I watched the bubbles slide over the rim of the sink, shimmering and popping like small, fragile moments of peace. Behind me, the sound of laughter carried from the living room. Their laughter. Once that sound had meant home to me. Now it only made me feel like a guest. When I finished, I turned off the light and walked down the hallway toward my room. The house smelled of soap and lemon polish. Family pictures lined the walls, Evan's graduation, our old family trip to the lake, Leo as a newborn. In every photo, I could see a version of myself that no longer existed. A younger woman, proud and busy, a woman with a purpose. I touched the frame lightly as I passed, leaving a fingerprint on the glass. My room was a converted storage space, barely large enough for the narrow bed and a small dresser. The window was too high to see out of. When I lay down, all I could see was a strip of ceiling and the shadow of the ceiling fan turning above me. It made a soft clicking sound with every rotation, steady and mechanical, like the heartbeat of a tired house. I stared at it until the shapes blurred. I tried to sleep, but sleep would not come. My hands ached. My thoughts wandered. Somewhere between the pain and the quiet, I wondered how a person can live her whole life in one home and still end up feeling like a stranger inside it. From the living room, I heard the faint murmur of their voices. Camille laughed again, soft and sharp at the same time. Evan said something I couldn't make out. The television flickered through the thin gap under my door, flashes of light cutting across the floor. I closed my eyes and thought about my husband. It had been 20 years since he passed, yet sometimes I still heard his voice in the house, gentle, patient, always calling me Sel. He was the kind of man who fixed broken things, clocks, chairs, people. I had loved him for that. When he died, I told myself I would keep fixing what was left. But now, I wasn't sure what was still worth fixing. That night, I did not cry. Tears feel useless when the people you love stop seeing you. Instead, I folded my hands on my stomach and whispered to the ceiling, "Tomorrow will be quieter." But even then, I knew quiet was not what I needed. What I needed was a way out. I lay very still and listened to the small sounds a house makes when it thinks everyone has gone to sleep. Water moved through the pipes. The refrigerator clicked and hummed. A car passed on the street and the headlights crept across the ceiling like a slow question that no one wanted to answer. I adjusted the pillow and told myself to breathe slower. I told myself that morning would feel different. People say that, as if light can fix what soreness lives in the heart. Minutes turned to more minutes. My hands began to throb in the quiet. I rubbed my knuckles one by one and remembered the first time they ached for real. I was grading essays at the kitchen table, a pile so high it leaned on its own like a tired tree. My husband put a cup of tea by my elbow and said I should rest. I told him I would finish the last 5. He kissed my hair and turned on the radio. We listened to a jazz station together without speaking. In that memory, the whole room felt warm and the night felt patient. I remember thinking that some houses know how to hold you. This one did once. Somewhere close to midnight, the television went quiet. I heard Camille walk down the hallway to the bathroom, her heels clicking lightly, a scent of lavender drifting under my door. Evan's footsteps were heavier and slower. He paused outside my room for a second, long enough for me to feel the heat of a wish rise into my chest. I wanted him to knock. I wanted him to say good night, Mom, and mean it the way he used to. The footsteps moved on. A door opened. A door closed. Water ran in the pipes again. I stared at the narrow band of window above me and tried to name what I was feeling. Not anger. Anger needs energy I could not find. Not grief either. Grief can be an honest thing when it knows that it has a reason. What I felt was a kind of thinning, as if the edges of my life were being sanded down by 1,000 small dismissals. The sharp corners that once made me a person were becoming rounded and smooth and easy to ignore. I thought about the first night I slept in this room. Evan and Camille had offered it with good intentions. They said it was quieter near the garage and that I would not have to climb the stairs anymore. Leo had helped me carry my box of books and my old wool sweater. He had asked 100 questions about every old photograph. I had told myself that the smallness of the room did not matter because love would fill the empty spaces. Love can do that. But love needs a place to sit and a voice to talk through. Love that is always quiet begins to look a lot like absence. I turned on the small lamp beside the bed and sat up. The light drew a pale circle on the wall. In the top drawer of the nightstand, I kept a rosary that belonged to my mother. The beads were smooth from years of fingers moving over them. I wound them through my hand and tried to pray. The words came out crooked and slow. I asked for a softer heart. I asked for a stronger spine. I asked for the wisdom to know when to stay and when to go. I did not ask for anyone to change. I am too old to waste wishes on other people's decisions. After a while, I slid the beads back into the drawer and opened the second one. Inside were small things that hold a life in place. A yellowed recipe card written in my husband's slanted hand. A Polaroid of Evan at 8 years old with scraped knees and a grin that could have lit an entire county fair. A ticket stub from the day we took Leo to the aquarium, and he talked to the turtles as if they understood English better than we did. I placed the Polaroid on the blanket and studied the boy in it. That child loved me with his whole face. I loved him with all my tired strength. I still do. The ceiling fan clicked again. The house settled like an old animal curling into sleep. I lay back down and let my mind drift to the classroom where I could still see the blackboard and the chalk dust curling through sunshine. I remembered a girl named Abby whose father drove a truck and whose essays always smelled faintly of diesel and peppermint. She wrote a poem once about an ordinary spoon that made me cry at my desk after the bell. She came back to visit me years later with a baby on her hip and a library card in her purse. I do not know why that memory came to me in the dark, but it softened something that needed softening. People surprise you when you let them. At last, my body gave me a little sleep. It was not the kind that heals. It was the kind that feels like drifting under a door and finding yourself on the other side without knowing how you got there. I woke before dawn with a stiff neck and a mouth that tasted like old metal. The house was quiet. The quiet felt honest for once. I sat up and put my feet on the floor and waited for the pain to announce itself. It did. The day had started. In the kitchen, the light over the stove was still on. I do not know who keeps it on at night, but I am grateful to them. The small puddle of yellow on the counter makes the room look almost kind. I filled the kettle and set it on the burner. The click of the ignition was louder than it should have been. I stood very still and let the promising sound of water heating be the first good thing that happened to me that day. I like to drink the first cup of coffee alone. It reminds me that I am a person before I am a mother or a guest or an inconvenience. I held the mug in both hands and watched the steam rise and disappear. I thought of the sentence from dinner, and I spoke it out loud to the empty room. You eat, but you do not help. Hearing it in my own voice took some of its teeth away. People say cruel things when they need to hide that they are tired. The trick is not to take in their tiredness and wear it like your own. Leo padded into the kitchen in pajamas that were too short at the ankles. He blinked at me and then smiled with his whole face, the way children do when they wake up and forget to be careful. I poured him a small glass of orange juice, and he climbed onto the chair with the wobble in one leg. We talked in the quiet way that makes a morning feel safe. I asked about the book he kept under his pillow. He asked if turtles sleep with their eyes open. We decided they might. He asked if I would be here after school. I told him I would always be somewhere he could find me. It is important to give a child an answer that is both true and safe. Evan walked in next and kissed the top of Leo's head. He nodded at me and opened the refrigerator. He looked like a man who had not slept well, though I doubt he would admit it. He asked Leo about a school project, and they talked about glue sticks and shoebox dioramas and whether it is possible to make a volcano without making a mess. I had an answer, but I kept it in my pocket. The kettle whistled. I turned off the flame. Camille arrived with her hair already perfect. She checked the calendar on her phone and told Evan that they would be leaving for the weekend after lunch. She said they needed a little space. I understood that I was not invited. I told her I hoped the weather would be kind to them. She said thank you in a tone that made the words slide off the table and fall to the floor. I packed Leo's lunch and tucked a note inside. It simply said, "I love you and I believe in you." I wrote it carefully so he could read the letters without guessing. He put his shoes on the wrong feet, and I fixed them, and he let me, and neither of us said anything about it. After they left for school and work, the house felt briefly peaceful in the way a stage feels peaceful after the actors have exited. I moved through the rooms softly, touching surfaces like I was blessing them. I watered the plant by the window that always leans toward the light. I folded a blanket that never stays folded. I picked up a small blue car from under the couch and set it on the shelf where I knew Leo would look for it later. I wrote a grocery list I knew no one would ask for. It does not take much to make a place kinder. It only takes attention. By mid-morning, the sun had moved high enough to pour through the kitchen window in a long, warm rectangle. I stood in it and let my fingers thaw. The pain retreated to a dull complaint. I heated a small bowl of oatmeal and ate it standing up. I have done worse things to keep my day from falling apart. The doorbell rang just before noon. A delivery man handed me a package addressed to Camille. I signed my name, and he left in a hurry. The box was light. For a long time, I considered the way my signature looked on the slip. It is a strange thing to realize that your name still belongs to you even when your life does not feel like it does. I put the package on the entry table. I did not move it again. The afternoon stretched. I sat at the small table by the window with a notebook and a pen. I wrote a list of things I am still good at. Listening, making soup from almost nothing, reading a room before anyone speaks. Finding lost buttons, remembering birthdays. I added starting over and then I crossed it out and then I wrote it again. I whispered the list back to myself like a spell. Late daylight makes everything honest. Dust shows itself. Corners reveal their secrets. In that light, I walked back to the hallway with the family photographs, and I stopped at the one from Evan's graduation. I remembered the speech he gave that day. He said he wanted to be the kind of man who made the people who raised him proud. I remember clapping until my hands hurt. I remember thinking that pride is a wide word and that I hoped he would understand that compassion fits inside it. The sound of a car pulled into the driveway. Doors closed. Voices approached. The house prepared itself like a host who knows which guests will find the cracks in the wallpaper. I stood in the kitchen and let the familiar rhythm return. Evan asked where the car keys were. Camille asked if the package had come. I answered without fuss. They carried bags to the trunk. The air at the door felt colder than the air in the rooms. Evan hugged Leo and promised to call before bedtime on Sunday. He turned to me and said thank you for holding down the fort. I said you are welcome. We looked at each other for a moment too long. Some moments can carry a bridge if you let them. We did not let this one. He went to the car. Camille kissed the air near my cheek. She told me Leo had a birthday party to attend the next day and the number for the other mother was on the fridge. She reminded me to water the fern properly. She told me to call if anything came up. I told her that nothing would come up. She smiled at that. I do not think she understood what I meant. The car pulled out of the driveway. The sound of its engine faded down the street. The house stood very still, the way a person stands after a door closes, deciding whether to breathe in or out. I went to the kitchen and washed the one cup I had used. I dried it and set it upside down on the dish towel. I wiped the counter until it felt smooth under my palm. I straightened the chair that never sits quite right. I stood there for a long time and listened to the clock. I thought about how a life can arrive at a thin edge where everything that comes next depends on a choice that looks small. The choice to stay silent one more day, the choice to speak, the choice to leave. I do not know if courage is a roar. For me, it has always sounded like a breath being gathered. The afternoon leaned toward evening. The rooms darkened. I turned on the lamp and the gold light pooled on the floor. I sat on the edge of the bed in the small room and looked at the suitcase under it. The zipper was slightly open as if it had been waiting for a signal. I did not touch it. Not yet. Not tonight. I lay back and watched the ceiling fan at its slow work. The clicking sound matched the rhythm of my heart until I could no longer tell which one was keeping time for the other. I thought about tomorrow and then I stopped. Tomorrow is a heavy word. The simplest promises are lighter. I promised myself a walk in the morning. I promised myself a hot cup of tea at dawn. I promised myself I would listen closely when the first birds tried the day with their small, brave voices. I closed my eyes. I could hear the house breathing like a tired animal. I told it that I was grateful for the years it held me. Gratitude is not a chain. It is a goodbye that does not tear. I slept then. The kind of sleep that comes when the body is too tired to argue with the soul. When I woke, the window held a rectangle of pale blue. The first light made a clean line across the wall. I sat up and I knew something had shifted, the way a person knows the weather has changed before the radio confirms it. My feet found the floor. My hands found the small rhythm they needed. The kettle found its whistle. The house found its morning. I stood at the kitchen table with my coffee and wrote a sentence on a scrap of paper. I will choose myself. I did not yet know what that would look like. I only knew that a different kind of quiet was coming. A quiet I could belong to. Morning always comes too early when you have not rested, and too late when you dread waking. I sat at the table with the same cup of coffee, the one I used yesterday, and watched the window change from gray to pale gold. It was Saturday. The house still smelled faintly of the dinner we did not finish. My hands felt swollen, but I wrapped them around the mug anyway. Warmth makes pain polite. The house began to stir. I heard Camille's shoes first, the sharp sound of her heels on the tile. She moved like a person already late for something, even when she was not. Evan followed, his steps slower, heavier. They talked about routes, weather, the hotel reservation, words about leaving. No one mentioned me. I smiled when Leo came into the kitchen, his hair messy from sleep. He climbed into my lap like he had done since he was a toddler. He smelled of toothpaste and safety. For a few minutes, the world felt right again. We ate oatmeal and laughed about the way raisins always hide at the bottom of the bowl. When Evan and Camille appeared, their luggage sat by the door. Camille reminded me about the instructions for Leo's medicine and where to find the emergency numbers. I nodded at all the right times. Evan said, "You'll be fine, Mom. We'll be back Monday." I wanted to tell him that being fine and being forgotten can look the same from far away. Instead, I said, "Have a good trip." Leo hugged me tightly before he left. He whispered, "Bring my blue car when you pick me up." I promised I would. When the car engine started, I stood by the curtain, hidden behind the fabric, and watched them drive away. The sound faded, but the silence they left behind did not. It filled every corner, climbed the walls, sat beside me on the chair. I turned off the television that had been left humming and sat down again at the kitchen table. The clock above the fridge ticked loud enough to feel like a question. "What now, Sela?" I looked around at the house. It was clean, perfect, lifeless. Every chair in its place, every picture framed straight, every sound too precise. I thought of all the homes I had known before this one. The small apartment Evan grew up in, full of pencil marks on the wall and plants that refused to die. The house my husband and I bought after 20 years of saving. The way sunlight once entered through the front window and landed directly on his chair, as if even the light had known where it belonged. I stood up and began to move without thinking. I washed the coffee mug. I folded the dish towel. I straightened the tablecloth that already sat straight. I opened the pantry just to close it again. By noon, the sky turned white with heat. I decided to go for a walk. The path behind the house led to a park where trees lined up like old men keeping secrets. I followed the dirt trail and listened to my own footsteps. A group of children played near the swings. I sat on a bench and watched them. Their laughter felt like a language I had forgotten. One of the mothers looked at me and smiled. I smiled back. She returned to her phone. A breeze lifted my hair, soft but cold. I wrapped my cardigan tighter and thought of the school where I used to teach. My students had faces full of possibility, and they always wanted to tell stories. Maybe that is what I miss most, being surrounded by stories that had not yet broken. When I returned home, the mailbox was full. 2 bills, a flyer for a yard sale, and a postcard from an old colleague who had retired to Florida. She wrote about sunshine and community yoga. I read her words twice, folded the card neatly, and set it beside the sink. The kitchen light flickered, though the bulb was new. I decided not to fix it. I made tea and took it to the back porch. The garden, once mine, now belonged to Camille's design, perfect rows of trimmed hedges, lifeless symmetry. My flowers were gone. She preferred order over color. I sat there until the tea cooled and the afternoon began to tilt toward evening. The world looked golden and tired. I thought about how many years I had spent waiting for someone to ask me what I wanted. Then I realized no one ever had. That thought stayed with me when I went back inside. It followed me through the hallway, into the small room by the garage. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the suitcase under it. I slid it out and unzipped it. Inside were clothes folded so long ago that they still smelled faintly of lavender soap. I added 2 dresses and a sweater. My hands moved quietly, almost gently, like I was tucking a child into bed. I did not know where I would go. I only knew that staying was a kind of dying that happened too slowly to notice. The next morning, before sunrise, I packed a few more things. My husband's photograph, my rosary, the notebook where I wrote poems no one had read. I left the rest. I did not take the wedding ring. It had already lost its meaning years ago when love stopped being something you could feel across a table. I set the keys on the kitchen counter beside the folded dish towel. I placed a note under them. It said, "Thank you for dinner." I walked to the door and turned the knob. The air outside felt sharp, almost clean. The first birds were awake, their songs too brave for the hour. I closed the door behind me and stepped into the pale light of the new day. I did not look back. I walked to the bus stop at the end of the street. The bench was cold. The metal burned against my hands. When the bus arrived, I climbed on and chose a seat near the window. My reflection stared back at me. A woman with gray hair, tired eyes, and a calm face that belonged to someone who had finally made a choice. The city passed by in soft motion. Houses, fences, a dog barking, a child running with a balloon. Each scene felt like a goodbye I had forgotten to say. A few stops later, an older man sat beside me. He looked at me for a moment and smiled. "You're Sheila Hicks, right? You used to teach English at Fairmont High." I turned toward him, surprised. "Yes," I said. "That was a long time ago." He nodded. "You read us that story about the woman who learned to swim at 50. I never forgot it." I laughed, a quiet sound that felt strange in my mouth. I always liked that story. He told me about his life, the small things that fill the years, grandchildren, a bakery, a knee surgery that did not go well. I listened. Listening is what I know how to do. When he left the bus 2 stops later, he said, "Take care of yourself, Ms. Hicks." As the doors closed, I whispered back, "I will try." The bus continued through streets I did not recognize. I did not know where I was going, but for the first time in a long while, not knowing felt like freedom. The bus hummed along the road like a long, slow thought that refused to stop. Outside the window, morning stretched itself across the rooftops. I watched the light move over the glass and felt the hours untangle behind me. I had left without a plan, but the lack of direction felt merciful. For the first time in years, the weight I carried was only mine. I got off in a small town 2 hours away from home. The station was quiet, except for the sound of pigeons pecking crumbs near the vending machine. The air smelled faintly of rain and gasoline. I stood there with my suitcase, looking at the street that curved downhill toward a cluster of low buildings. Somewhere down that street was a place I could rest for a few nights. I found a boarding house near the church. The sign outside read Maple Rest, though nothing about it looked restful. The woman at the front desk had kind eyes but a wary tone, as if she had learned to measure every stranger before deciding how much warmth to offer. I told her I needed a room for a week, maybe longer. She handed me a key and pointed down the hall. The room was small but clean. A single bed with a quilt patterned in faded roses, a lamp missing its shade. A small wooden chair beside the window. I set my suitcase down and sat for a long time, letting the stillness settle. Outside, I could hear church bells marking the hour. I took out my notebook, the one I always carry, and wrote a single sentence. When silence becomes a habit, it begins to sound like safety. Then I closed the book again. That evening, I walked to a nearby diner. The waitress called everyone honey and poured coffee as if it were a blessing. I ordered soup and bread. The man in the booth beside me was reading a newspaper. I caught the headline about rising house prices and wondered how much my old home would be worth now that I no longer belonged to it. As I ate, I noticed a group of elderly people at the counter, laughing too loudly over pie. Their laughter startled me at first, then made me ache. I had forgotten what that kind of sound could do to a room. One of them caught my eye and smiled. A woman with silver hair pulled into a loose bun. She wore a bright red scarf, far too bold for the gray day. When I paid my bill, she said, "You're new here." "I suppose I am," I said. "You staying at Maple Rest?" I nodded. "Then we'll see you around," she said, her smile wide enough to make me believe it. Her name, I would learn later, was Martha. But that night she was just a stranger who noticed I existed. Back at the boarding house, the hallway smelled faintly of old paper and lavender polish. A radio played softly somewhere behind a closed door. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. My thoughts were quieter now, though not gone. I thought of Leo, his small hands holding the blue toy car. I wondered what he would think when he woke and found I was gone. I told myself I would call, eventually. But not yet. I needed a little time to remember who I was before I belonged to anyone. The next morning, I woke early and went to the park across the street. The grass was wet with dew, and pigeons fluttered around an empty fountain. I sat on a bench and watched the town wake. The bakery opened its doors. The first bus rumbled past. Somewhere nearby, someone played a violin softly, the melody floating through the air like an unfinished sentence. When I returned to the boarding house, the manager handed me an envelope. "This came for you," she said. It was from the lawyer, Jonas Marrow, my husband's old friend. My heart quickened as I opened it. Inside was a short note written in careful script. "Seela, I came across some documents belonging to Daniel's estate that you may want to review. I believe they concern the house on Birch Lane. Please call or visit when convenient. JM." I read it twice. My hands trembled slightly, though I wasn't sure if it was fear or fatigue. I had not spoken to Jonas since Daniel's funeral. The last time I saw him, he had shaken Evan's hand and told me to take care of myself. Then he had turned away, carrying his briefcase and his sympathy in equal measure. For years, I had assumed everything about the house was settled. Daniel had left us comfortable but not wealthy. After his death, I simply moved through the motions: paperwork, condolences, bills. I signed where people told me to sign. I trusted that the world would be kind to a woman doing her best to survive. Now, holding that letter, I felt a quiet stirring of curiosity, like dust being lifted from a forgotten shelf. What could possibly be left to know? I decided to visit Jonas the next day. That night, I found Martha in the lounge of Maple Rest, knitting something that looked like a scarf but could have been anything. She waved me over. "You're the new one," she said. "Come sit." Her voice was brisk, but her eyes were warm. "I'm Martha," she said, extending a hand. "Used to be a nurse, retired 5 years ago or maybe 10, I stopped counting." "Seela," I said, shaking her hand. She nodded. "That's a good name, sounds like a pause in a song." "I suppose it is," I said, smiling faintly. She studied me for a moment. "You look like someone who's carrying too much quiet." I laughed softly. "Maybe I am." "Well," she said, returning to her knitting, "don't let it drown you. Quiet's good company until it starts talking back." We sat together for a while, not saying much. The sound of her needles filled the space between us. There was something easy about her presence. She didn't ask why I was there or where I came from. She just accepted that I was, and for now, that was enough. When I went to bed later, I found myself thinking about her words, carrying too much quiet. It sounded true in a way I didn't want to admit. The next morning, I dressed carefully, as if preparing for an exam I had forgotten to study for. I took the bus across town to Jonas's office. It was tucked above a pharmacy, the kind of place that smelled faintly of paper and dust. His secretary led me in. Jonas looked older, smaller than I remembered. His hair had thinned and his glasses sat lower on his nose, but his voice was the same, patient, deliberate. "Seela," he said, standing to shake my hand, "it's been too long." "Yes," I said, "it has." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "I'm glad you came. I found something that should have reached you years ago." He opened a folder and slid a document across the desk. My name stared back at me from the top in crisp black letters. The title read Property Deed Transfer, Birch Lane Residence. I blinked, reading the lines twice to be sure. The house, the one I had just walked away from, was listed under my name. Not Daniel's, not Evan's, mine. "I don't understand," I whispered. Jonas leaned back, folding his hands. "Daniel transferred the house to you before he passed. He said it was to ensure your security. I assumed you knew." I shook my head. "No one told me. I thought it was his, then Evan." Jonas looked at me with gentle confusion. You signed the acknowledgement in 1996. Here. He pointed to the bottom of the page where my own signature curved in faded ink. I stared at it, remembering nothing. The letters looked like mine, familiar and foreign all at once. I sat very still, feeling the floor tilt beneath me. Jonas sighed. You're the legal owner, Sela. The house is yours. It always has been. I looked up slowly. Does Evan know? He hesitated. I doubt it. Something inside me shifted then. It wasn't anger, not even vindication. It was clarity, quiet and startling. For so many years, I had believed I was living in someone else's space, but it had been mine all along. I had been invisible inside my own walls. I thanked Jonas and left the office. Outside, the air felt different. Lighter somehow. As I walked toward the bus stop, I thought about the note I had left on the counter. Thank you for dinner. I almost laughed. The keys I had placed beside it, the house I had surrendered without question, all of it had belonged to me. A small sound escaped my throat, part laughter, part disbelief. The people passing by looked at me and then looked away, as people do when they see someone talking to ghosts. But I wasn't talking to ghosts. I was talking to myself, to the woman who had spent her life saying yes when silence would have been enough. That evening, when I returned to Maple Rest, Martha was waiting in the lounge. She looked up from her knitting and said, You found something today, didn't you? I nodded. Good, she said. Just don't let it own you before you decide what to do with it. I smiled. I think it's the other way around, she grinned. Then maybe you're finally waking up. I sat in the lounge with Martha long after the others had gone to their rooms. The clock on the wall hummed softly, its tick too polite to interrupt us. Martha's knitting needles flashed in the lamplight. She worked the yarn with the rhythm of someone who trusted her own hands more than her memories. She did not ask for details, but she waited in that quiet way that invites truth. It seems, I said slowly, that the house I walked away from was mine all along. Martha did not look up. Yours on paper or yours in peace? On paper, I said. Peace will take longer, she replied. Her words settled in me like a stone dropping into still water. I thought of Evan and Camille, the laughter I had heard from behind the kitchen door, the sound of my own breath in the room beside the garage. Every part of that house had felt borrowed, but now I understood that I had lent it to them. I had given them everything because I believed I had nothing to give. Martha tied off the end of her yarn. You're not the first woman to forget what she owns, she said. We get so used to giving things away that we stop keeping track of where they land. I smiled faintly. Maybe I needed to lose it to see it. She leaned back, satisfied. Then you're already ahead of most. That night I couldn't sleep. I opened my notebook and wrote under the line I had written yesterday. Silence feels safe until it starts lying. I closed the book and stood by the window. The town was dark except for the faint glow of a street lamp outside. The light cast a circle on the pavement where moths spun their endless dance. I wondered how many nights I had spent spinning inside my own circle, calling it patience. I woke early and walked to the church on the corner. Its doors were open, and the smell of candles filled the air. I sat on the last bench and looked at the stained glass window. Morning light passed through it, painting my hands in colors I hadn't worn in years. For a long time, I said nothing. Then I whispered the only prayer that made sense. Let me be brave in small ways. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of rain. I wrapped my coat tighter and started walking. The streets were empty except for a boy delivering newspapers. He nodded at me politely, and I nodded back. At the corner, I stopped by a bakery. The windows were fogged from heat, and the smell of bread reached out like a memory. I bought a loaf and tucked it under my arm. When I returned to Maple Rest, I found Martha at the table, pouring herself tea. She looked at the bread and smiled. See, you already know how to take care of yourself. I suppose I do, I said. We shared breakfast in easy silence. Between bites, she asked, What will you do about the house? I hesitated. I don't know yet. For now, I don't want it. Martha stirred her tea. Sometimes not wanting something is the first step to using it right. I watched the steam rise from my cup. Maybe, I said, but I think it's time it became something different, something that doesn't hurt anyone. Martha nodded as if she already knew the answer before I spoke it. That afternoon, I called Jonas. My voice did not shake. I want to sell it, I said. Quietly, no notice, no drama, just make it clean. He hesitated for a second, then said, If that's what you want, I'll handle it. It's what I want, I replied. After I hung up, I sat very still. It was strange how letting go of something could feel more like reclaiming it. For years, I had been afraid to speak, afraid that noise would break whatever fragile peace I still had. But now, in the quiet hum of the afternoon, my own voice sounded like freedom. That evening, I went for a walk with Martha. The streetlights had just come on, spilling golden circles on the pavement. She talked about her daughter who hadn't called in months, about the way loneliness makes people invent reasons for silence. I listened. Listening is what I do best. After a while, she said, "You remind me of myself 10 years ago, only I left too late." I looked at her. "Too late for what?" "For forgiving myself," she said softly. "When my husband died, I stayed in that house like a ghost. I thought if I kept everything the same, maybe time would forget to move on. It didn't." I understood then that leaving wasn't the hardest part. It was deciding to stop apologizing for leaving. When we reached the park, we sat on the same bench where we had met the day before. The fountain was still dry, its stone basin cracked with age. Martha looked up at the empty sky. "You know," she said, "people think getting old means running out of time, but maybe it just means running out of excuses." Her words made me smile, though I felt a lump in my throat. Later, back in my room, I unpacked the few things I had brought. The photograph of Daniel, the small rosary, my notebook. I placed them on the dresser like small anchors. I looked at the empty space beside them and realized I didn't need anything else to make the room mine. I opened the window. The cool air smelled of rain and faraway places. Somewhere, a train whistled, long and low, the sound of distance turning into promise. I thought of Evan then, of the last time he smiled at me with kindness. It had been years. He was 17, angry at the world for reasons he didn't understand. Daniel was in the hospital, fading faster than either of us could accept. One night, after visiting hours, I signed a paper that changed everything. I hadn't thought about that paper in years, but the memory came back now, sharp and full. I remembered Daniel's words. "Do whatever you need to, Seela, just keep Evan safe." Maybe that was the first time I learned what it costs to love someone more than they want you to. I closed the window and sat on the bed. I did not cry. I simply breathed, long and slow, until the room stopped spinning. I looked down at my hands, at the lines time had carved into them. I realized they were the only map I would ever need. When I turned off the light, the darkness did not feel heavy. It felt wide. For the first time in years, it did not belong to anyone but me. I whispered to the quiet, "Tomorrow I will start something new." And the quiet, for once, did not answer back. The morning began with the smell of rain. It wasn't heavy, just a steady whisper against the window that made the air smell like wet wood and new beginnings. I woke before the others, wrapped my shawl around my shoulders, and sat at the small table by the window. The town was quiet, washed clean, the streets glistening like glass. I made tea and watched the steam rise. It felt strange, this kind of calm, the kind that did not come from submission but from choice. Every sound felt softer. Every thought arrived slower. I wrote in my notebook, not to record my life, but to remind myself I was still living it. "I am not waiting anymore," I wrote. When I went downstairs, Martha was already in the lounge, watering the old spider plant near the window. She looked up and said, "You have that look." "What look?" "The one people wear when they've made a decision before breakfast." I smiled. "You might be right." "What decision?" "To stop being invisible," I said. She nodded approvingly. "Good, that one's overdue." We shared breakfast in easy silence. Afterwards, I told her about my idea, how I wanted to turn Daniel's house, the one that had never felt like mine, into something else before selling it. Not a museum of memories, not a shrine to what was lost, but a place that could hold new stories. "What kind of stories?" Martha asked. "The kind that belong to women like us," I said. "The ones who spent years caring for everyone else until we forgot our own names." Martha leaned back in her chair. "You mean a shelter?" I nodded. "A small one maybe, just to start. A house for those who need somewhere safe to remember who they are." Her eyes softened. "That's a fine idea, Seela Hicks, a fine one indeed." By afternoon, I called Jonas again. "I changed my mind," I said. "Don't sell the house yet, I want to use it first." He hesitated. "Use it for what?" "To help people who need a place to rest." He sighed, the sound of a man who had learned not to argue with women like me. "All right," he said. "Just promise me you'll handle it properly." "I will," I said. After the call, I felt something stir inside me, not the kind of excitement that burns out quickly, but a steady pulse, like a lamp relit after years of darkness. That afternoon, I took the bus back toward the old neighborhood. The closer we got, the quieter I became. Each landmark felt like an echo. The grocery store where Evan used to beg for candy. The church where Daniel's funeral had been held. The street sign that still leaned slightly to the left, the one he always meant to fix. When the bus stopped at Birch Lane, I hesitated before stepping down. My house, the house, stood at the end of the street, the same pale blue, the same trimmed hedges. The curtains were drawn. Camille's flowers still sat by the porch, perfectly arranged. I stood across the street for a long time, watching. The windows reflected the gray sky, giving nothing away. The air smelled of damp earth and memory. My heart thudded quietly, steady and firm. I didn't walk closer. Not yet. Some distances need to stay measured for a while before they close. I turned away and walked to the small cafe at the corner. It had changed ownership, but the smell of coffee was the same. I sat at a table near the window and ordered tea. The waitress brought it with a smile that reminded me of a student I once had, though I couldn't place the name. I opened my notebook and began sketching ideas. Rooms with soft light. Shelves of books. A kitchen where people could sit and talk without fear of being dismissed. I imagined laughter filling the walls again, not the sharp laughter of Camille, but something rounder, warmer, the sound of people remembering themselves. When I looked up, rain was still falling, slow and patient. The kind of rain that doesn't wash things away but teaches them how to shine differently. I paid the bill and left a tip larger than I could afford. On the way back to the station, I passed the post office. For reasons I couldn't name, I went inside and bought a small envelope and a single sheet of paper. I sat at the writing counter and began a letter. Dear Evan, I hope you and Camille are well. I left because staying had become another way of disappearing. I have learned something I think you should know. The house is mine was mine, but that's not the part that matters. What matters is that I've decided to make it something good before it belongs to anyone again. You don't owe me an apology. I don't owe you one either. Take care of Leo. Tell him his grandmother found her place. Mom. I folded the paper, sealed the envelope, and addressed it carefully. I did not write a return address. Some stories don't need replies. When I left the post office, the sun had begun to break through the clouds. The street looked sharper now, every color brighter, as if the world had exhaled. I returned to Maple Rest that evening with a quiet satisfaction humming through me. Martha was sitting by the window, reading. She looked up and said, "You went back, didn't you?" "Yes," I said. "Did it hurt?" "Yes." "Was it worth it?" I thought for a moment. "More than I expected." She smiled, the kind that comes from understanding rather than joy. "Then you're getting close to peace." That night, I couldn't sleep again, but it wasn't from worry. It was from energy, the kind that builds when something inside you finally wakes up. I got out of bed and opened the drawer of the nightstand. Inside, beneath the Bible and a pack of tissues, was a folded piece of paper I hadn't noticed before. It was old and yellowed. Across the top, in neat handwriting, were the words, "For the one who stays." I unfolded it carefully. Inside was a short note written in Daniel's unmistakable script. "Seela, if you ever find this, it means the world has moved on faster than we expected. You have always carried more than your share. When you finally put it down, build something beautiful with the space it leaves behind." The paper trembled in my hands, the room around me blurred. For a long time, I just sat there, the letter resting in my lap, the weight of it both heavy and light. He had known. Somehow, he had known all along that I would need a reason to stay alive after everything else faded. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I'm trying, Daniel, I really am." When I looked up again, dawn was already painting the walls gold. By the time the first light filled the room, I was still sitting with Daniel's note in my lap. The paper had softened from my touch, and I could see how his pen had pressed into the fibers with certainty. He had written those words knowing I would one day need them. That knowledge settled into me like warmth after long cold. I made tea and took it to the window. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street shone with the pale gold of sunrise. The birds were louder than usual, as if they had been waiting for someone to finally listen. I whispered into the steam of my cup, "I'm building something beautiful, Daniel." Saying it aloud made it feel real. Later that morning, I packed a small bag and went out. I stopped at the town library first. The librarian was a thin woman with a kind smile and the calm that only comes from a lifetime spent among quiet things. I asked if there were any local groups for women in need of temporary housing or safety. She thought for a moment, then brought me a list of phone numbers and organizations. I thanked her, took the sheet, and sat down at one of the tables near the window. The library smelled of paper and dust, my two favorite scents of time. I spread the paper out before me and began circling names. Each one felt like a door opening just slightly. I made calls all afternoon. Some went unanswered. Some led to polite refusals, but one voice stayed on the line. It belonged to a woman named Ruth who ran a small community center 2 towns over. She said, "We always need safe spaces. If you have a house and the will to share it, you have everything you need to start." Her certainty steadied me. I took down her address and promised to visit the next day. When I hung up, I felt a quiet surge of purpose. It was not excitement or pride, but something cleaner, clarity maybe. A line in the fog. That evening I told Martha about Ruth and the plan. She listened, nodding slowly. A place for women, she said, a place where silence heals instead of hides. Yes, I said, exactly that. She took my hand. Then you must name it right, names matter. I thought about it for a long moment. I'll call it Birch Haven, I said finally. After the street, after what I left behind. Birch Haven, she repeated. That sounds like a promise. The next day I traveled to Ruth's community center. The bus ride took 2 hours, but it felt shorter. Ruth was waiting at the door when I arrived, a tall woman with gray curls and an easy laugh. The building was old but full of life. Children's drawings covered the walls, and the smell of soup drifted from a kitchen somewhere inside. We sat together in her office, sunlight pouring through the blinds. I told her everything about Daniel's house, about leaving, about the note I found. I expected pity, but Ruth only looked at me with quiet admiration. People like us, she said. We're taught to disappear. You're doing the opposite. You're building proof that you existed. I smiled. That's what it feels like. She helped me draft a plan, what licenses I would need, how to manage donations, what kind of help to ask for. It all sounded impossible and yet strangely manageable, like a map I could finally read. Before I left, Ruth gave me a hug. When you open it, call me, she said. I'll bring blankets and stories. On the way back to Maple Rest, the bus rolled through the hills, the light shifting between clouds. I pressed my forehead to the glass and let the motion rock me. For the first time in years, I felt forward movement that wasn't running away. That night, I spread Daniel's note on the table and read it again. Then I wrote my own below it on a clean page. Daniel, I found what to build. It will not be perfect, but it will be alive. And that is enough. I folded the paper and placed it back in the drawer. Days passed like that, slow but full. Martha helped me make calls. Ruth sent forms and lists. I reached out to Jonas for legal advice, and he surprised me with how readily he offered help. You have no idea how rare it is to see someone your age start something new, he said. I waited long enough, I told him. When he laughed, I realized how long it had been since a man's laughter had not hurt me. One evening, a letter arrived addressed in Evan's handwriting. My heart clenched before I even opened it. Mom, we came back and found your note. I didn't understand at first, but Camille did. She said maybe we made things too small for you here. She was right. Leo misses you terribly. He carries the blue car everywhere. He wants to know if you'll come to his play next month. I hope you will. Also, the lawyer called. He said the house is yours. I didn't know. I should have. Love, Evan. I read it 3 times, the words blurred but not from pain. It was relief, simple and deep. I placed the letter beside Daniel's note, 2 voices from 2 lives, both finally seeing me. I wrote back the same evening. Evan, I am proud of you for writing. I'm building something called Birch Haven. When it's ready, you and Leo can visit, not as guests, as family. Tell Camille I wish her peace. Tell Leo that turtles do sleep with their eyes open. Love, Mom. When I sealed the envelope, I felt something close inside me, not like a door, but like a wound finding its final breath before healing. Later, I sat by the window with Martha. She was working on a new blanket, bright red and soft. She said, "You should put this in your house when it's ready. Red keeps people warm even when they forget to light a fire." I touched the yarn. Then it'll be the first thing I hang there. We watched the street lamps flicker on. The night was calm, and for once it felt like it belonged to both of us. When I went back to my room, I opened the drawer again. The 2 letters and Daniel's note lay side by side like 3 chapters of the same story. I added 1 more paper, a fresh page with a single sentence. The house that once held my silence will soon hold other women's voices. I closed the drawer gently. Outside, the rain began again, soft and steady, the sound of the world washing itself clean. I whispered into the quiet, "I'm home, Daniel." And for the first time, it felt true. It began with dust, a kind of soft rebellion that hung in the air as soon as I opened the front door. The house smelled exactly as I remembered: lemon polish, old air, and the faint ghost of Camille's perfume. I stood in the doorway for a long time, breathing it in. The quiet wasn't cruel anymore, it was full of possibility. I had brought a small suitcase, my notebook, and the red blanket Martha insisted I take. When I spread it over the couch, the room immediately looked less like a memory and more like a beginning. I started cleaning that first day. Every drawer, every shelf, every trace of the life that had lived here before I left. I scrubbed the kitchen until my hands ached. I opened every window to let in air that hadn't been touched in weeks. The wind lifted the curtains, made them dance like they had been waiting for someone to set them free. By the end of the day, the floor was littered with old papers and dust cloths. I made myself tea and sat in the empty living room, surrounded by boxes labeled Keep, Donate, and Let Go. The last pile was the biggest. The sun dipped low, painting everything in gold. I whispered to the walls, "You're going to have a new purpose now." The next morning, I called Ruth. "Ready for work," I told her. She arrived 2 days later with 2 volunteers, a young woman named June with bright green hair and a retired carpenter named Harold whose smile was as steady as his hands. They came armed with paint cans, brushes, and optimism. We began in the living room. The walls turned from pale yellow to a soft cream. June hummed while she painted. Harold whistled something that might have been a hymn. I washed windows and repaired curtains. By noon, the house already felt lighter. Ruth stood in the doorway, hands on her hips. "This place is going to breathe again," she said. I smiled. "It already has." That night, after everyone left, I sat alone with a notebook on my lap. I wrote the words Birch Haven at the top of a fresh page, then listed what we would need: beds, linens, chairs, a kettle, books. I could almost hear Daniel's voice teasing me about my lists, the way he used to when I planned our first classroom library. A few days later, Martha called. "How's the house?" she asked. "Alive," I said. "And waiting?" "I might have something for you," she said. "A woman named Greta. She's been staying in the hospital waiting room for weeks. She's quiet but kind. She needs somewhere gentle to land." "Send her," I said without thinking. Greta arrived the next morning with one small bag and eyes that looked like they had forgotten how to trust light. She spoke softly, as if her voice might disturb something fragile. I gave her tea and let her choose her room. She chose the one facing the garden. That night she cooked dinner for both of us, soup made from what little we had in the pantry. It was simple, but it tasted like company. We ate in silence, broken only by the sound of spoons against bowls. Afterward she said, "I can help paint if you need it." "I'd like that," I replied. In the days that followed, Birch Haven began to transform. The rooms filled with color and sound. June came back with her brother, who fixed the front steps. Ruth brought shelves from the community center. Harold built a long table for the dining room, saying every home needs a place where stories can meet. When we finished, the house looked nothing like the one I had left. It was still mine, but it no longer belonged to my grief. Every night, Greta and I sat on the porch with cups of tea, watching the light fade from the sky. She told me little by little about her life, a husband who drank too much, a daughter she hadn't seen in years. Her words came slowly, but each one seemed to make her taller. "You know," she said one evening, "this house feels like it forgives people." I smiled. "That's what it's meant to do." We were quiet for a while, then she said softly, "Who forgives you, Seela?" The question caught me off guard. I stared at the horizon, the sky bruised purple and gold. "Maybe I'm still learning how to," I said. Greta nodded, as if that was an answer she understood. Weeks passed. Birch Haven became a small but steady rhythm. Women came and went, some stayed a few days, others longer. Each brought pieces of themselves and left something behind. A book, a recipe, a laugh that still echoed in the kitchen after they were gone. One morning, while sweeping the hallway, I found an envelope slipped under the front door. There was no return address. Inside was a short note in familiar handwriting. "Mom, Leo has a school project about heroes. He said he wants to write about you. Could we visit next week? Love, Evan." My heart stuttered. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I read the note again, my fingers trembling. A hero. That word felt too big, too sharp, but also too kind. When Ruth came that afternoon, I showed her the letter. She grinned. "You see, even the hardest hearts can soften." I laughed, though it came out more like a sigh. "I'm not sure mine has yet." "Oh, it has," she said. "You just don't hear it beating differently yet." I spent the rest of the week preparing. Not cleaning, the house was already tidy, but arranging small things that felt like welcome. A vase of flowers in the hallway, Leo's favorite cookies on the counter, a drawing he once made of a turtle taped to the fridge. When the day came, I stood on the porch, hands clasped, heart restless. The car turned into the driveway slowly, cautiously. Evan stepped out first, taller than I remembered, his face lined with fatigue. Camille followed, her smile uncertain but genuine. And then Leo ran past them both, his blue toy car in one hand, his voice breaking the stillness. "Grandma?" He ran into my arms and the world folded back into color. I held him tight. "You grew," I whispered. He laughed. "You didn't." Behind him, Evan approached. He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. "The place looks different," he said. "So do I," I replied. He nodded. "I wanted to see what you made." "Come in," I said. "It's not much, but it's home for some." Camille smiled faintly. "That's more than most can say." Inside, the house seemed to exhale. Greta brought tea. Ruth arrived soon after, as if she had known this meeting needed witnesses. For a while, everyone just sat, letting the quiet settle around us like sunlight through the windows. Then Leo pointed to the wall where Daniel's photograph hung. "Who's that?" I looked at Evan before answering. That's your grandfather. He built this house. Evan's voice was low. And you built what it became. I met his eyes and saw something I hadn't seen in years: respect. For the first time, it didn't hurt to remember. That evening, after dinner, the air in the house felt thicker than usual, not heavy, but expectant, like the walls themselves knew something was about to be said. Ruth had left with a wave and a promise to return with more supplies. Camille had offered to wash the dishes, and Greta, gentle as always, kept her company. Leo had fallen asleep on the couch, a blanket draped over his small shoulders. The soft rise and fall of his breathing filled the quiet. Evan and I sat at the table, the same table where I had once felt invisible. Now it gleamed under the low light, the grain of the wood catching every flicker of the lamp. He turned his cup in his hands and stared at it as if it could tell him what to say. "I should have known," he began quietly. "About the house, about everything." "You couldn't have," I said. "You were busy living." He shook his head. "No, I was busy pretending we were okay, pretending you didn't feel trapped here. I knew you did, Mom, I just didn't want to see it." The sound of the rain outside filled the pause between us. I waited. I had learned that silence is sometimes the only gift you can give a confession. He sighed. "When Dad died, I thought I had to take care of you. That's what people told me. Be strong for your mother, they said, but I didn't know what that meant. I thought it meant keeping everything the same. The house, the routines, the quiet. I didn't understand that all of that was killing you." My throat tightened. "You were 17, Evan." He laughed bitterly. "Old enough to think I knew better. I remember the night you signed that paper. Dad told me you didn't need to worry, that he had taken care of it. I didn't ask what it was. I just assumed it meant something practical. When the lawyer called last week and told me you owned the house, I looked through his old papers. Mom, he wrote a letter too, to me." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. The paper was yellowed, folded neatly, but worn from being read too many times. He slid it across the table. I hesitated before touching it. "Read it," he said softly. The handwriting was Daniel's, firm, deliberate. My breath caught as I read. "Evan, if your mother ever leaves, let her. She's been carrying more than her share of ghosts, and one day she'll need space to put them down. Don't follow her right away. Wait until she builds something new. When you see it, you'll understand the kind of strength that raised you. Love, Dad." The room blurred for a moment. I set the letter down carefully, afraid that even breathing too hard might erase the words. Evan's voice broke the silence. "I think he knew all of this would happen. I think he knew you better than I ever tried to." I reached across the table and took his hand. "He knew us both," I said. "He always did." Evan's eyes glistened. "I'm sorry, Mom, for letting you feel small, for not seeing what you needed." I squeezed his hand. "You see it now, that's what matters." He nodded slowly, his thumb tracing the edge of my fingers like he was relearning the shape of forgiveness. "I want to help you with Birch Haven, if you'll let me." The words caught me by surprise. "You," he smiled faintly. "I'm not much good at building houses, but I can paint, fix shelves, drive people, do whatever you need. I want to be part of what you're doing." Something inside me eased. "Then you already are." From the kitchen, Camille's voice drifted softly. "The dishes are done," she said as she entered, drying her hands on a towel. Her eyes moved from Evan to me, then to the papers on the table. "Is that his handwriting?" she asked gently. "Yes," I said. "Daniel," she nodded, her expression softening. "He had a way of seeing through people, didn't he?" I smiled. "He did." Camille hesitated, then said, "I'm sorry too, Sela, for the things I said, for the way I treated you. I thought I was helping, I was." I looked at her, really looked, and saw not the woman who had once wounded me, but someone carrying her own quiet weight. "Apology accepted," I said simply, "but only if you promise to forgive yourself too." Her eyes widened. Then she nodded. Leo stirred on the couch, murmuring something in his sleep. Evan rose to carry him, the boy's head resting against his shoulder. Watching them, I felt the room fill with a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. It was fragile, yes, but real. When they left that night, the house stayed warm. The scent of their visit lingered: soap, rain, and something new. Belonging. After closing the door, I walked through each room slowly. Greta was humming softly upstairs, her voice carrying down the staircase like a lullaby. In the kitchen, Camille's teacup still sat by the sink. I left it there. Some remnants are worth keeping. I returned to the dining table and unfolded Daniel's letter again, placing it beside Evan's. The 2 pages lay together, words bridging years of silence. I added my own, written quickly but clearly. "Daniel, you were right. He understands now, and I am no longer afraid to be seen." I placed my letter on top of theirs and left them there, like layers of time folded neatly into one another. Later that night, I stood on the porch with my tea. The moon was full, silvering the wet leaves on the birch trees that lined the yard. The air was cool and alive. I thought of the women who would soon fill this place with their stories, their laughter, their healing. I imagined them sitting at that same table, finding their voices again. Behind me, the house creaked softly, settling into its new life. I whispered into the night, "It's done, Daniel. We're all coming home in our own way." The wind moved through the trees like a slow exhale. The birches swayed, their pale bark glowing like quiet sentinels. For the first time, the word home didn't sound like a memory. It sounded like a promise. The first winter at Birch Haven came quietly. The trees around the house turned bare, their branches black against the sky, but the rooms inside stayed warm. We had painted the walls soft shades of cream and pale green, colors that looked like calm. The red blanket Martha made for me hung over the back of the couch, its color steady as a heartbeat. By then, 5 women lived here. Greta stayed, saying she felt like the walls listened when she spoke to them. She became the unofficial caretaker of the kitchen, always stirring something on the stove that smelled like home. Then there was June, who had lost her job and her faith in people at the same time. She painted the doors and the window frames with steady hands, as if she could rebuild her trust through brushstrokes. A woman named Tessa arrived one evening in the rain, clutching a suitcase and a letter from Ruth. She didn't say much, only that she needed to rest. I gave her the small room by the stairs, the one that used to hold boxes of old Christmas decorations. The next morning, she came down wearing my spare apron and started baking bread. The smell filled the house like sunlight. Each woman brought a piece of her world with her, and the house held them all without judgment. We ate together, worked together, sometimes cried together. Some stayed a week, some stayed months, and every time one of them left, she would stand by the front door, hand resting on the wall, as if saying goodbye to something that had quietly loved her back. In the evenings, after everyone went to bed, I would sit at the big table and write in my notebook. I called it the Book of Staying. In it, I recorded what the women had taught me, not their secrets, but their strengths. I wrote, "Greta reminds me that kindness is a kind of armor. June shows that trust can be painted back into the world. Tessa proves that silence can smell like bread when it's ready to rise." Sometimes I added my own lessons. Forgiveness does not mean returning, it means building a door where a wall once stood. By spring, Birch Haven had a rhythm of its own. Donations began arriving, books, blankets, furniture, small envelopes with kind notes. The town started talking about the house on Birch Lane, the one that had once been silent and now glowed with evening light and laughter. Martha visited often. She had grown frailer, her steps slower, but her eyes still held that spark. Every time she came, she'd look around and say, "You've made the quiet beautiful, Seela." I always told her, "You helped me learn how." She would laugh and say, "Maybe. Or maybe you just needed someone to remind you that your voice could be soft and still shake the world." One afternoon, while we were sitting on the porch watching the birch trees sway, Martha said something that stayed with me. "You know, when people come here, they don't stay because they're lost. They stay because for the first time they're found." I nodded. "I think that's what Daniel meant when he said to build something beautiful." Martha smiled, her gaze distant. "He was a wise man. You should listen to him even now." Later that evening, as the women gathered for dinner, I heard laughter from the kitchen. It was June's laugh, sharp and surprised, like a window breaking to let air in. I realized I hadn't heard her laugh before that day. It made something inside me ache and heal all at once. After dinner, Tessa sat at the piano in the corner of the room. She played softly, her fingers uncertain but brave. The notes drifted through the air like a memory that refused to fade. Greta hummed along, and even June tapped her foot. I sat by the window and watched the reflection of the room in the glass, the women moving, talking, breathing, alive. I saw myself among them, not as the caretaker or the teacher, but as one of the women who stayed. That night, as I was locking the doors, I found a small card tucked under the vase of flowers on the entry table. The handwriting was careful, almost hesitant. "Thank you, Ms. Hicks, for teaching me that leaving is not the same as failing. June." I held the card to my chest and whispered, "You taught me that too." Over the next few months, the house grew busier. Ruth began sending more women our way, and even the local newspaper wrote a small piece titled "The Quiet Miracle on Birch Lane." I kept the clipping in the drawer with Daniel's note and Evan's letter. Evan and Leo visited often. They brought supplies, tools, and small gifts from Camille, jars of jam, fresh herbs from her garden. Camille still spoke softly, carefully, but her smile was genuine. Sometimes she and I would sit together in the kitchen and talk about recipes or Leo's new hobbies. We didn't need to talk about forgiveness anymore. It was already living quietly between us. Evan helped me repair the roof that spring. While we worked, he said, "You know, I used to think you left because you stopped loving us." I looked at him. "And now," he smiled. "Now I know you left because you loved us too much to let us keep hurting you." His words landed gently, like rain after a long, dry season. When we finished the repairs, we sat on the porch with lemonade and watched the sunlight filter through the birch leaves. Leo ran across the yard chasing butterflies, his laughter echoing between the trees. Evan said quietly, "He's proud of you, you know. He tells his friends his grandmother saves people." I laughed softly. "I don't save anyone, Evan. I just give them a place to remember they were never lost." He nodded. "That's more than saving." That night, after they left, I stayed outside long after the lights inside went out. The birch trees whispered softly in the wind, their leaves glinting under the moon. I thought about all the women who had come through this door and all the ones still to come. Each of them had left something behind, a part of themselves, a fragment of courage. And then I thought about the part of me that had stayed. The woman who once sat alone in a storage room with a ceiling fan that clicked too loudly was gone. The woman who stood under these birch trees now was someone Daniel would have recognized, someone Evan could finally understand. I whispered to the night, "We're all still building, aren't we?" The leaves rustled as if answering yes. Inside, the house glowed with the faint light of the kitchen lamp, the smell of Greta's bread still lingering in the air. It smelled like belonging. And for the first time in my life, I realized belonging was something I had built with my own hands. Spring melted into summer, and Birch Haven felt almost like a living thing. Every door creaked differently, every window hummed with the breath of the women who had passed through it. Even the floorboards seemed to remember footsteps with affection rather than weight. The house had learned to hold both silence and laughter without breaking. But that summer also brought a different kind of stillness. Martha stopped visiting as often. At first, she said it was because of her knees or the heat or her garden that needed tending. But when her letters grew shorter and her handwriting shakier, I knew something deeper was happening. One morning, Ruth called. Her voice was soft but steady. "Seela," she said, "Martha's in the hospital. She asked for you." The world seemed to quiet all at once. I arrived that afternoon. The hospital room was bright, filled with the kind of white light that tries too hard to be comforting. Martha was propped up on the bed, smaller than I remembered, her skin translucent against the pillow. But her eyes were still full of mischief and clarity. "You took your time," she whispered when she saw me. "I had to bake your favorite bread," I said, setting the small wrapped loaf on her bedside table. She smiled faintly. "You remembered. I remember everything you teach me." She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing carefully. "Then I've done something right." I sat beside her, holding her hand. It felt fragile but warm, like the handle of a teacup used every day for years. We talked for hours. About Birch Haven, about Greta and June, about the women who had come and gone. Martha listened with a kind of pride that made my chest ache. Finally, she said, "Seela, there's something I never told you." Her tone changed, slower, heavier. I leaned closer. "When I was young," she began, "I worked as a nurse. It was a small hospital outside of Boston. There was a man there once, a patient, who used to talk about his wife all the time. Said she had the kindest voice, said she made lists for everything, said she'd probably outlive the stars. His name was Daniel Hicks." The words hit me like a tremor. I froze. "Daniel?" she nodded. "I didn't realize it was the same Daniel until I heard you say his name that day at Maple Rest. He was sick even then, but he always smiled when he spoke about you. He told me once that he hoped you'd find peace, even if it wasn't with him." My eyes stung. "He said that?" She nodded again. "He did. And when I met you, I thought, well, maybe life isn't so cruel after all. Maybe it gives people back to each other in strange ways." I couldn't speak. I just held her hand tighter. Martha looked at me with that same knowing smile she always had. "You were his peace, Seela. Even when you thought you lost him." Tears slipped down my cheeks. "You could have told me. I didn't want to steal your discovery," she said. "Sometimes the heart needs to find things on its own." We sat in silence for a long time, the kind that doesn't feel empty. She closed her eyes, her breathing slowing. "Promise me something," she whispered. "Anything. Keep the house open, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts." I nodded, unable to speak. She smiled one last time. "Good girl," she murmured. The room grew still. The steady beeping of the monitor softened until it became only silence. I stayed with her until the nurses came. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, handed me an envelope. "She said to give you this," she whispered. I took it with shaking hands. On the front, in Martha's familiar handwriting, were the words, "For when you forget who you are." I didn't open it then. I couldn't. Outside, the afternoon light was golden and unreal. The birch trees along the street looked like they were bowing to the wind. I walked slowly back to the bus stop, clutching the envelope in both hands like it might break if I let go. That evening, back at Birch Haven, the house was full. The women were laughing in the kitchen, the sound of spoons clinking against bowls, the smell of bread rising. I stood in the hallway, listening, the envelope still unopened. Later, when everyone was asleep, I sat by the window and finally tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Martha's handwriting trembled but was clear. "Selah, when the world gets quiet again and you start to think you're disappearing, remember this. You built a place where women like us come back to life. That means you can too. And if you ever need to find me, look in the spaces between the laughter. I'll be there, knitting something red. Love, Martha." The tears came slowly, silently, until I was laughing through them. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside Daniel's note and Evan's letter, the holy trinity of my life's second chance. The next morning, I hung a new sign by the front door. The letters were painted in soft gold against wood, Birch Haven, for those who stay. The women gathered around as I nailed it into place. Greta said it was beautiful. June cried softly. Tessa brought a pot of marigolds and set them by the steps. I looked up at the house, the windows shining, the walls breathing, the porch creaking under our feet, and I thought of Martha, of Daniel, of the long road that had brought me here. "I'll keep it open," I whispered. And the wind, moving gently through the birch trees, seemed to whisper back, "You already have." That night, as the women slept and the moonlight spread across the floors, I felt something shift inside me, not grief, not even peace, but a kind of knowing. A quiet certainty that I was part of something larger than any loss. The house that once held my silence now carried the voices of women who had learned to stay. And for the first time, I didn't feel like their keeper. I felt like one of them. Autumn came early that year. The air turned sharp and clear, carrying the smell of wood smoke and falling leaves. Birch Haven glowed against the season like a lantern, warm from the inside, unafraid of the cold creeping closer. Every morning I woke to the sound of footsteps in the kitchen, laughter in the hallway, the clinking of mugs. The women had made this house their rhythm, and somehow that rhythm had become mine too. But even as life moved gently around me, I could feel something stirring beneath the peace. Not fear, more like the low hum before a song begins. I knew something was waiting for me. One evening, Ruth came by carrying a box of papers. "I found something in our archives," she said, setting it on the table. "It has your husband's name on it, Daniel Hicks." My heart fluttered. "What kind of papers?" "Old grant documents," she said. "Community funding proposals from almost 20 years ago. I think he was trying to start something back then, something called Haven House. I thought you might want to see them." I stared at the box. The name alone made my hands tremble. Haven House. After Ruth left, I sat down and opened it. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, sketches, and letters. Daniel's handwriting filled every line, confident but patient. He had drawn plans for a house, not ours, but one meant for others. There were rooms labeled rest, study, and gather. There were notes in the margins. Must feel like safety, must smell like coffee and books. Not a shelter, a home that remembers. Selah would know how to make the quiet kind. My breath caught. I turned another page and found a letter addressed to me. It was dated 3 months before his diagnosis. "My Selah, if I never get to build this with you, promise me you'll build it anyway. You have always known how to turn silence into something holy. Call it Haven. Call it Birch. Call it whatever name feels like forgiveness. It's yours already. Daniel." I sat there for a long time, my hands pressed against the paper as if I could reach through time. He had dreamed Birch Haven before I did. I had built what he could not finish. Without knowing it, I had carried out the blueprint of his love. The tears came slow, quiet like rain on glass. I wasn't crying from grief this time, but from awe, the way life loops back, weaving meaning into places we thought were just coincidence. When Greta came in and saw me, she said nothing. She just placed a hand on my shoulder, gentle and sure. Later that night, I gathered everyone in the dining room. The long table glowed under the lights, bowls of soup steaming, bread still warm. I set Daniel's papers in the center. "This house," I began, "didn't start with me. It started with him. Daniel wanted a place for people like us long before I ever found the courage to make it real. I thought Birch Haven was my second chance, but maybe it's his gift, one that waited until I was ready to accept it." The women listened in silence, their faces soft in the candlelight. Greta reached across the table and took my hand. "Maybe it was meant to wait," she said. "Yes," I whispered. "Maybe it was." After dinner, I walked outside. The air was cool, carrying the scent of rain and birch bark. The trees shimmered under the lamplight, their leaves whispering like pages turning. I looked up at the windows glowing gold and thought, "We did it, Daniel. We built it together." A week later, Evan called. "Leo wants to visit again," he said. He says he has something for you. When they arrived, Leo ran straight to the porch, clutching a folder. He opened it proudly. Inside was a school essay titled My Hero, My Grandma Selah Hicks. He read it out loud, his small voice shaking with excitement. My grandma built a house for people who need to feel safe. She says it's not about saving them, but reminding them that they were always strong. I think she saves them anyway. When he finished, the room fell into a silence that glowed. Evan was standing behind him, his hand resting lightly on Leo's shoulder. You always said you weren't a hero, he murmured. Maybe you just needed someone else to write it down first. I smiled, my throat tight. Maybe. After dinner, while Leo played with Greta's cat, Evan helped me bring boxes down from the attic. I wanted to show him Daniel's plans. We spread them out across the table. Evan traced the drawings with his fingers. He really thought of everything, he said. Look here, this is almost exactly how you laid out Birch Haven. I nodded. He always had a way of seeing what I couldn't yet. Evan's voice softened. Maybe that's where I get it from. We laughed quietly, then his face grew serious. Mom, I never told you this before, but when Dad got sick, he made me promise something. He told me to take care of the house. I thought he meant the building, now I think he meant you. I reached out and touched his cheek. He knew you would try. He also knew I'd have to leave for you to learn how. He smiled sadly. You really think he planned all this? Not planned, I said. Trusted. We sat in the golden light of the kitchen, surrounded by blueprints and half-finished cups of tea. The air felt full of presence, of love that had learned to change shape but never vanish. When Evan and Leo left that night, I stood on the porch long after their car disappeared. The moon hung low, pale against the drifting clouds. I whispered, It's all connected, isn't it, Daniel? And somewhere in the soft wind moving through the birch leaves, I heard it, a faint, familiar laugh. Not a ghostly sound. Not memory, something alive, threaded into the very air I breathed. Inside, the women were singing softly. I recognized the tune, one of the hymns Daniel used to hum while fixing things around the house. Their voices carried through the halls, blending into the creak of the floors and the sigh of the wind. For a moment, everything, the past, the pain, the hope, existed in the same breath. And I thought, maybe that's what forgiveness really is. Not erasing what was, but letting it live beside what's still becoming. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The house was still, wrapped in the kind of silence that feels alive. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, Daniel's plans still spread out before me. The lamplight brushed across his handwriting, and I traced the ink with my fingertips. For the first time, I realized something I had never noticed. On one of the last pages, faint and almost hidden, he had drawn a small outline of a birch tree. Its roots tangled beneath the house, its branches reaching high above it. Underneath, in tiny letters, he had written, Everything that grows here must come from love. I stared at the words until my eyes blurred. All this time, the name Birch Haven hadn't come from me at all, it had come from him. Somehow, I had carried his dream forward without knowing it, guided by a quiet hand I couldn't see. The air in the kitchen seemed to hum, not with sadness but with recognition. The house was not a monument to what I had lost. It was the continuation of everything Daniel had wanted to leave behind. By sunrise, I was already moving. I brewed coffee, woke Greta, and together we began preparing breakfast. The smell of butter and bread filled the air, and one by one the women came downstairs, sleepy-eyed but smiling. The light spilling through the windows made the whole room look golden. When everyone sat down, I said, We're going to make one change to Birch Haven. June frowned. A change? Yes, I said, holding up Daniel's sketch. From now on, we're calling this room the Haven Room. It's where we'll eat, talk, and remember the people who helped us stay. Tessa smiled. It's perfect. Greta nodded. Daniel would like that. I met her eyes, surprised. You never met him. She shrugged. Maybe not. But I think I see him sometimes in the way you move through this house, in the way you look at people and see what's still good in them. Her words filled the room like a soft chord. That evening, as the women cleaned up after dinner, I stepped outside. The birch trees were beginning to turn gold again, their leaves whispering against the dusk. The air was cool, the kind of quiet that makes every sound sharper. I walked to the garden behind the house. It had started as a small patch of herbs but had grown into a place of color, marigolds, lavender, and pale roses climbing the fence. In the center stood a single bench, the one Harold had built that spring. I sat there and let the world settle around me. The hum of insects, the slow rhythm of the wind, the faint sound of laughter from the kitchen. And then I heard a new sound, footsteps on the gravel. When I turned, I saw a woman standing at the gate. She looked about 40, her clothes neat but worn, her face familiar in that way strangers sometimes are. She hesitated, holding a small bag against her chest. Are you Ms. Hicks? She asked softly. I am, I said. Come in. She stepped closer. I was told this was a place for women who need a place to rest. You were told right, I said. You're welcome here. She looked down, her eyes glistening. I don't have much. Most people don't when they arrive, I said gently. You'll have enough. She smiled faintly and followed me inside. As she stepped through the doorway, she paused to touch the frame like she could feel the stories the wood held. What's your name? I asked. Grace, she said. I felt something shift at that word, Grace. It wasn't just her name, it was what the house had always been teaching me. Grace in leaving, grace in staying, grace in becoming. Later, after everyone had gone to bed, I went back to the garden. The sky was full of stars, so many it felt like the world was breathing light. I sat on the bench and looked up through the birch branches. I thought of Martha knitting something red somewhere beyond the horizon, of Daniel's steady hands drafting blueprints under a different kind of light, of Evan and Camille learning how to love each other without fear, of Leo's laughter echoing through rooms that used to echo with silence. And then I thought of the women sleeping inside, Greta, June, Tessa, and now Grace, each carrying pieces of their old lives, mending them here, in a house that remembered how to listen. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you." The wind stirred, brushing against the birch leaves. It sounded almost like an answer. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking backward or forward. I was exactly where I was meant to be, sitting in the middle of everything that had survived. The night deepened, the stars humming their quiet song, and I felt Daniel beside me, not as memory, not as longing, but as part of the air itself. I smiled. Everything that grows here must come from love, I whispered, repeating his words. And Birch Haven, my Birch Haven, seemed to breathe in agreement. The newspaper came the next spring. The headline read, "Birch Haven expands, a legacy of healing." The article told the story, not mine, but ours. The women who came, the ones who stayed, the house that changed shape but never spirit. It ended with a quote Ruth had given them. Some homes are built from wood and brick. Others are built from forgiveness. I cut out the article and placed it in the drawer beside the letters. Daniel's, Evan's, Martha's, and my own. The drawer was full now, a small archive of love and loss and beginning again. Outside, the birch trees had grown taller. Their branches brushed against the windows like gentle reminders that everything worth keeping bends with the wind. I walked out to the porch and stood in the morning light. Birds darted between the trees, their wings flashing silver. Behind me, the sound of laughter rose, the new women at the table, starting breakfast, starting again. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and smiled. Because in that moment, I knew I hadn't just built a house. I had built a life that finally stayed.